Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 188 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, as always, the best and... I don't know where I was going with that.
The best and brightest.
I am your host... Yeah, the best and brightest. That could have been it. Actually, let's go with that. The best and brightest host, the Orange Tank. And with me, as always, are the green and red tanks. Hello, Mark and Kellen. How are you doing?
Doing good.
This week, we're going to be talking about the lengths that we have gone to get games. You know, like some of these games are out of print or they're not easy to acquire. So what lengths have we gone to? How far have we traveled? What have we paid to get specific games into our collection? And even broader than that, what have we done just to have certain games played? That is coming up later in the episode. But before we get there, let's talk about the games that we've been playing. Mark, why don't you kick us off?
I've been on a Wallace kick since we talked about him in our designer series a couple episodes ago. So I played one of his older games, Tinner's Trail. And I say older games. I know this was, I think, just released to Kickstarter backers, but I played an older copy. First of all, a quick note about this older copy. One of the reasons why I have not played it until just now, even though I've had it for a couple of years now, maybe, is that it is a typical looking older Euro game in terms of like components and in terms of box art. Like it is brown. There is like just variations on brown. Okay. So it was hard to sell to people when they look at it, even though I have a signed copy.
Whoa.
Yeah, that should have been
of the original?
Of this version. I don't know if this is the original version, but I do have a signed copy. But yet,
impressive.
That was not enough to get people to play. And then when you actually open up the box, because, you know, sometimes the cover looks bad, but, you know, you open up that box, the Kalis with the dour-looking guy on it, but there's some things going on the board. It looks interesting. This board is just as drab, and worse yet, in one of the weirdest pieces of graphic design that I've ever seen, the information on the board is printed in 3 different orientations. So, like, if somebody's sitting on one side, they get 1/3 of the information on the board clear because it's facing them. A person sitting on the other side gets the orientation fine, and the person sitting on the third side sees 1/3 of the information fine. But in order to see all of it, everybody is going to have to be moving around the table to get to see things clearly. It's very, very strange.
I love this. Or just constantly describing what they're seeing.
Right, exactly. Hey, can you tell me what that chart says? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very strange in that respect. I mean, interesting. It's certainly interesting. But that being said, that out of the way, Tinner's Trail, what you're doing is you are auctioning for mines in England and then trying to extract the tin and the copper from them and selling them. One of the many interesting aspects of the game is that at the end of every round, you are forced to sell all the copper and the iron that you have acquired at a market price, and the market is an interesting aspect as well. But so you make this money from selling the goods you've acquired, and then you get a chance to sell them for victory points, basically. And all the victory points that you can acquire in this game are only during this end of round sequence where you're buying victory points for the money you've made from selling your ore. There's no victory points for resources. There's no victory points for leftover material. It's all based on buying these victory points at the end of every round. And the exchange rate from round to round, this is a 4-round game, gets worse and worse. So if you spend money in the first round, you'll get the best bang for your buck in terms of buying victory points. And in the last round, when you have nothing else to do with the money, because money is worth nothing, there's no like $5 for a point or anything like that. The exchange rate for the victory points at the end of the game in that final round is the worst of the 4 rounds. So it's a very clean way of seeing like how many points you have. There's no trying to hoard something to get another avenue of points. It's very clean in that way. Another very interesting aspect, and probably the crux of the game, is the way that you take turns. There is a turn order track, and you have basically action points. You have 10 action points per round. And the way it works is that there is a chart numbered from 1 to 10, and when you take action points, you move down the chart. So if I've taken 1 action point, I'm on the 1 spot, and then if I take an action taking 3 action points, I move down to the 4 spot, and then to determine who's next in turn order, it's whoever is farthest back. So it's that thing where you can do one of the big actions and spend a lot of action points to do it, but then you're waiting for other people to catch up, and there is a biding your time aspect of the game where you don't want to take a big action. You just want to wait and get your opponents to have like very few action points left and then string a bunch of actions together, but that can also backfire as well.
Sorry, just to clarify what you just said there. So does that mean that the other players could be taking several turns before it gets back to you in
that's
an
correct.
example like that? Got it. Okay.
If I've only used one action point, somebody's now used 4, I could theoretically do like 3 actions before it's their turn again, depending on the actions you do. And the actions that you're doing are very, very simple. It's a very simple chart on the board. Basically, you're spending actions to refine these mines that you've purchased, because when it comes to extracting material and ore from your mine, it's completely free except for however many water cubes are in a mine. So if I have a mine that has 5 copper and 5 tin and no water, I can extract it for free. Whenever you take an extracting action, though, it adds a cube of water. And then the next time you want to extract, every cube that you want to extract costs $1. So the amount of money it costs per cube to extract is equal to the number of water cubes. So water is the bane of your existence. And so you're doing all these things. You're acquiring different things like a port, like a railway, to increase the amount of cubes you can draw out of your mine, and also to lessen the amount of water that is in your mine. It's a very, very, very simple rule set. For as many interesting aspects there are to this game, it's a very, very simple rule set. It feels like typical Wallace, like just a type of game that you've seen before, economic action point thing, but done it in a really fresh way. I mean, I say a fresh way for a game that came out about 25 years ago at this point. But it almost feels in a little bit like a stripped down Brass in a way. There isn't that sort of communal sharing of infrastructure. There's a touch of that with one of the resources you can buy, which is called an Addit. But it just feels like a interesting economic game done in a very fresh way. And I don't know what the differences are between the older version and the newer one that just got released, but after playing this, in terms of, like, we were talking about acquiring games in this episode and what the lengths you've gone to do so, I mean, the latest version of Tinner's Trail is going to be high on my list of games to acquire for sure. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't know that much about this. It being a Martin Wallace game, it automatically has me intrigued, especially when you're saying it's sort of at the middle of the weight spectrum, and especially if you have any comparisons to Brass, I'm suddenly very interested. But what caught my eye about this is, like you said, it started to fulfill on Kickstarter, so people have their new editions of this, and it's a pretty nice looking production in the newest version. So my hope is that this is going to be what the Roxley edition was to Brass is for Tinner's Trail, like opening it out to a wider audience through the power of production, effectively, because, like you said, that older version is pretty ugly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we saw the way that Brass sort of exploded when Roxley took over and made that incredible production. I think that this is not as highly regarded. Certainly, it hasn't been as highly regarded as Brass. I think Brass has always been more highly regarded, even before Roxley. But the thing that encourages me about the chances of the popularity of Tinner's Trail taking off is the simplicity of it. Like, Brass, as great as it is, and I love Brass, there is a bit of a rules grit to it. Tinner's Trail is just so stripped down that I think it's much easier to get to the table. But I would highly recommend anybody who is interested in strange, off-kilter games or a fan of Wallace, if you haven't played Tinner's Trail, by all means, definitely check it out.
Cool.
So that is Tinner's Trail by Martin Wallace.
So I've played a game called The Night Cage, and this was kindly sent to us by someone in our Discord. I'm not sure the details here exactly, but they received their Kickstarter copy and somehow ended up with 2 copies of this. So House Rules 42 in the Discord was kind enough to send one of their copies to me. This is a cooperative game by Smirk and Laughter, which has recently fulfilled on Kickstarter, and it is sort of like a cooperative labyrinth game. So if you imagine this board that just starts with this grid of empty squares, and at the start of the game, everyone that is playing appears on one square of their choice on the little starting tile. That tile has 2 exits leading out from it, and the way this works, everyone is carrying a candle in the darkness, so you can see the tiles that are immediately adjacent to you along those tiles. So you draw 2 tiles from the stack, you place them face up on those tunnels, and now you can see what the adjacent rooms are effectively. But one of the catches to this is supposed to be sort of a magical shifting labyrinth, right? So if you were to go down a tunnel and get far enough away from a square, that square would disappear. And if you were to backtrack, it would be something different. So it's not like a fixed labyrinth that is changing as you move around it. The aim of what you're trying to do is eventually find, through revealing tiles from the stack, a key, one for every single player, and crucially, you can never hold more than one key, and once a key appears, it's on that tile, and then again, if you move away from that key, it disappears. Now, there are more keys than there are players, so there's a little bit of leeway there, but not that many. So there's this element of once you find a key, you either need to hover near it or find a way to connect up to another player so they can pick it up, because you cannot carry more than one key. You can hand off your key to someone, but you can each only carry one. Now, once you all have your keys, you all have to convene on one other tile that you have to find, which is the gate, the exit gate. And once you've done that, once everyone has a key and they've all made it onto one tile, then you've won. And the ways that you would lose are just the ways you'd expect if any of that becomes impossible. So like you've lost all the keys, you've lost the gate, you've made it all the way through the stack, because then what happens is you start to have to pull off tiles from the board in addition. Now that would seem fairly trivial and fairly just rote in terms of the exploration if it wasn't for this additional element, which are there are monsters in this dungeon. So when you uncover one of these monsters, they attack everything in their line of sight, which also hits your stack of tiles. I think you lose it's 3 tiles from that stack if you get hit by them, and they can hit like infinite directions that they can see. So there's this idea that if you move into their line of sight, they might hit multiple people in all 4 directions. So that's kind of the gameplay loop, is just trying to figure out, well, we want to stick together because we want to be on top of each other when we find a key or a gate, but we want to be too close together because then we get hit by monsters multiple times. So that's the dynamic. You're exploring, you're sort of convening. If a monster hits you, your light also goes out and you need to find someone else to relight it. So that's basically it. You're moving through it, trying to find it. But if it hasn't become apparent yet from that description, I would say that the biggest issue that this game has is you're kind of just blindly searching for stuff that you need. And it's kind of like you go down a tunnel and you draw a tile and it's not the key you need. So you keep going. What makes that worse is the tiles that aren't the things I've specifically described. So if it's not a key, if it's not a gate, if it's not a monster, it's just an empty passageway. Right. So it's just kind of like majority of the deck is just dull.
Right.
Until you find like a key, and then there's a point of interest there, and then the game convenes around trying to get someone that key. But what was happening in our games frequently was, man, we just need to get Dean this key, so let's keep walking around until we find it, and then just never happens. And then everyone's just kind of milling around back and forth because they have the things they need until it gets back to Dean's turn. And I found that happening pretty frequently, even the times I played it solo. So that was a pretty frustrating exercise. I've played one game with like the more advanced tiles that change things up in interesting ways, but never in a way that made it feel very compelling. It kind of just feels like you're just ambling around waiting to either win or lose. And that's not to say there's no strategy to it whatsoever, because, there are interesting choices to be made, but it just didn't feel dynamic in the way that I was hoping it would. What they're going for instead is a game that kind of just has a very specific like aesthetic and like this thematic appeal, because, they've put a lot of thought into making, through the imagery, there's kind of like this dark, I don't want to say disturbing, but it is very evocative, It's like very simple abstract imagery, not unlike something like an Onirim, like that sort of feeling where it kind of evokes a place that has like an air about it. So I think they were pretty successful in that regard in terms of the look and the feel of the thing, but gameplay-wise, we were all a little bit underwhelmed.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Onirim call, I think is an accurate one. I have not played this game, but looking at the images here on BGG, yeah, it has that very sort of like a lot of skeletons, a lot of like creepy black and white.
Yeah, the monsters kind of just, look like bundles of teeth and arms in a way that's very abstract. They're not very specifically realized. They live a little bit more in your imagination than they do on the tile. I like that aesthetic a lot. But yeah, as someone that's not, unless a game is sort of specifically trying to tell a story, I'm not always the most like thematic gamer in that sense. Like I'm not like going to imagine a place so much as have an experience that's been more prescribed, I would say. And this didn't really deliver that. And unfortunately, the gameplay just felt a little bit simplistic. And I think one of the things I've said multiple times is difficulty is often the death of a good cooperative game. And we were able to beat this on the first try.
Okay, yeah. That's
which is always a bummer.
Do you get the sense that the advanced version would be A, more difficult, and B, the truer way to play it? Any sense of that?
So, having played it once solo, yes, it does feel like there's kind of this idea that the normal mode, let's call it rather, is, because it is not billed as a beginner's mode.
Okay.
It's billed as the normal and the advanced game, right? But the advanced game does feel like, okay, this is how the game is meant to layer in its complexity, but it didn't change the core loop into being something that was, like, suddenly interesting.
Sure. Just another quick question. I feel like it probably doesn't do anything to combat the quarterbacking issue.
It doesn't at
Yeah,
all.
okay.
No, because it's effectively...
Could be played like four hands or two-handed or something.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, the solo game, you're just playing 4 characters. Like, so it's a game that just divides the decision-making amongst the team. So, yeah, there's nothing in the way to stop someone, like, dictating the flow of the game to everyone. Which, again, is not something I necessarily expect from a cooperative game,
Sure.
but I always admire it when they do think of that. There are no rails to prevent that in this.
And length of game?
It's fairly breezy. Like, it's about half an hour, 45 minutes maybe. So, it definitely doesn't drag on. I'll give it that. And, the tension as you're running out of tiles is something, but it's not enough.
Sure.
But that is The Night Cage by Smirk and Laughter. Kellen, what have you been playing? Okay, cool. We can move on. Let's get into a review before we get into the feature topic. One of the things that we like to do is read out reviews from some of our listeners, and this is a very easy way that you can help out the podcast. So we really, really do appreciate it. You can leave us reviews on Apple Podcasts. I believe that all the other means to do that don't really exist anymore. Last time we dug into this. But regardless, let's read out a review this week. This one comes from JRU05. And they say, I feel new to the board game hobby and I don't think I really understand much of what they're talking about, but I look forward to figuring it out. Informative and fun. I really appreciate how they don't bore us with 25 minutes of witty banter, quote unquote, and then once the topic is discussed, episode over. No long dismount.
In and out. That's us. I do appreciate the dismount reference this close to the Olympics.
That's true. It is very, very
On topic.
Well timed. Thank you so much, J. Roo. That's a great review. We really, really appreciate it. One other thing before we go, we are going to be at Strategicon on Labor Day weekend. This is the Los Angeles convention at the Hilton LAX. Please come join us. We haven't got all the details yet exactly about what time we'll be arranging this, but there will definitely be some sort of meet where we will get together and play some games. So if you're planning on being at Strategicon, or if you are in the LA area and want to come join us, that will be Labor Day weekend. You can find out that through their website, which is...
I think strategicon.net. And I would say, like, if you are already on the Discord or maybe not on the Discord and are interested in Strategicon, great thing to chat about on the Discord. We have plenty of folks in and around the Southern California area on the Discord who have gone to Strategicon, including all 4 of us. And so if you're interested and have any questions, let us know as we get closer and our plans firm up. Go to the Discord and say, hey, when are you guys expecting to play? Or, hey, I've always wanted to play XYZ. Does anybody have a copy? Let's play it. Because I'll tell you what, I'm down for that. So I'm sure other people are going to be interested as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know some of your biggest, like, planned event games, like Twilight Imperium, happened around Strategicon. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, conventions obviously lend themselves to that type of thing.
That's
so,
the time to get them played. Let's move on into our feature topic this week. We're going to be talking about the lengths that we've gone to play and acquire games. So really quickly, what are some of the reasons that we might go out of our way to acquire a game? Like, I think the things that fairly obvious that come to mind is games go out of print. Like a much beloved game from years ago suddenly just disappears from the market and there's no easy way to acquire it anymore. And I think there's a fair number of games like that, which we'll be talking about in the next few minutes, which definitely fit this category. But Mark, what are other reasons that you've gone out of your way to like acquire specific games?
I think the other big reason that I've really gone after a game is just of how hot it was. And this is actually one of the reasons why I'm not so susceptible to the sort of FOMO, I need to get a game now thing anymore, because I've been, frankly, burned a couple times chasing after that hot game and then having less than stellar results afterwards. So
yeah, I think without further ado, let's just jump into a story that you might have about some extreme lengths that you went to.
Yeah, so in mentioning the chasing the hotness thing, this wasn't a game that had just come out. In fact, this is quite an old game. This is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. It had been out of print for years and years and years, and then got a resurgence. It just became something that people were talking about. I don't know if Shut Up and Sit Down did a review of it, but I just remember it being very popular. And, I wasn't very familiar with it being a game from like the early 80s. But it seemed like something that was right up my alley. Like this whole thing about it. It's sort of like the choose your own adventure thing, but a much more gamified version of it. And I see Callan rolling his eyes right now as I say this. So it seemed great. And this was during a point in my life when I was trying to get some of my soccer friends. My friends come in 2 major flavors, which are my board game friends and my soccer friends. And I was trying to get some soccer friends over to the board game side. And so I had envisioned this thing where we were going to have like a Sherlock Holmes consulting detective night where people would be wearing like deerstalker hats. What do you call them?
Deerstalkers? Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And, like having like bubble pipes or whatever and pouring over these mysteries and having a blast. But it was way out of print. And anytime a copy came onto the secondary market, it was just like snapped up or exorbitant prices. And then I found somebody who was selling it. I think it was through the Reddit Monthly Bazaar or something. And they were in Southern California. And I think at this point, maybe I was like checking on an hourly basis or something. I was just really, really trying to find this game. And so somebody was selling it. They were in Southern California. And so I immediately told them, like, I'll get it. I'll pay cash. I'll come right now and get it. And they said, sure. But I'm in, and I can't even remember where it was. And I said, yeah, I'll be there. What day is good for you? And it was like the next day. And then I looked at the driving directions to see where I promised to go. And it was like an hour and a half away or something like that. It was this incredible drive. But I didn't even care. Like, I was so on a Sherlock Holmes consulting executive high that I was like, I'll do it, whatever. And I think I had like an appointment afterwards or something. And the traffic was bad. So I ended up being on the road, I think, for something like 2 hours to get this game. And then I'm meeting this person at a Starbucks and they couldn't make it. And they tell me on the way, like, I don't think they knew how far I was driving because I probably would have been embarrassed to tell them. So they texted me and said, like, hey, I'm running 20 minutes late. And I had an appointment that I had to go to. So I actually could not stay and wait for them.
Oh, no.
So I ended up saying, okay, I still want the game. And like, I still wanted to pay them so badly to lock in my claim for it that I said, okay, I'm going to hide the $40, I think it was, something like that, underneath the like trash can in the Starbucks bathroom, and then just like take the money and mail me the game because you're local, so it won't be long in the mail. And that's what happened.
Wow.
So I went to the Starbucks that I'd driven 2 hours to get to, put this $40 like on the bottom of a trash can or something, and then drove another 2 hours back, was late for my appointment, got the game, and then tried to cajole friends to play this epic game of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Finally got the game together after more weeks of getting the schedules to line up, and it just like fell flat. It was just God. I mean, I think it's a game that's okay for solo or for two people, maybe three, but it's just basically reading. You're basically reading things out loud and trying to figure out cases that are often take great leaps of logic. The original versions, and I think even some of the reprints had like, I think, errors. Like some people would say like avoid case number 3 or something because there's a big mistake. And so it was just such an ordeal and such a disappointment. So yeah, that was one of the games.
I love the idea. I think this is the first ever time I've heard of a dead drop money exchange for a board game, that's amazing.
It was ridiculous.
What's funny is actually you reminded me, and I hadn't like thought about this one in the lead up to this episode, but Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is also kind of a side tangent here about, I also had a weird time trying to acquire this because of the exact thing you just mentioned, where the previous editions, I can't remember when exactly, because this has had multiple reprints. Yeah. This is like a game from the 80s.
Yeah.
But the edition that was the most prominent when I entered the hobby, maybe like 10 years ago, they had just done a second print run of that fixed a lot of the print issues in, I believe, their original reprint of it. But the only way that you could distinguish copies was by like looking at the barcode number.
Oh, right, yeah.
So I was like cold messaging people on like BGG being like, can you just tell me what the barcode number on the back of this is? Trying to find the specific reprint of it. So I remember that actually being a weird little ordeal for myself as well. But yeah, I don't have anything that's quite as wild as that. But like in a similar vein of like a high expectations leading to kind of just a massive disappointment, and not really a disappointment because this is just a lot more typical of me, I guess. But I played the World of Warcraft board game for the first time maybe like 7 years ago, and at this point in time I was still on the tail end of being quite into World of Warcraft. I wasn't as into it as I was in college, because who is in anything really? But I still had a lot of like affection for the license. But so when I played the board game, it's kind of surprisingly good, especially if you're a fan of the license, a fan of the game. So I kind of decided that at this point that having played a friend's copy, I was going to get World of Warcraft, the board game. Now, this is a game that was not very, very out of print, but like Fantasy Flight had lost the license to Blizzard at this point, so they weren't selling it anymore. And it's kind of just like, it's a massive, massive box. We're talking about like a Twilight Imperium 3 size box, like this massive rectangular block. So it's kind of obnoxious to have shipped or anything like that, and copies on eBay were just going for absurd amounts of money. But because I'm me, I didn't want just the base box. I wanted the base box and the 2 expansions for the game, all of which are out of print. And because like I was weird about it, so I wanted to make sure they were all in good condition. I didn't want any of them to kind of just be like nasty, because it's also a box that like famously collapses under its own weight. So it's very hard to find editions that don't have completely manged corners, which actually eventually mine disintegrated as well. As you might remember, Mark.
I do remember,
trading mine away because I did never play that copy of World of Warcraft after having acquired it. It just sat languishing in my closet for years and years and years and years.
But you had played it. You had played in the past.
I had played it once. I had played another friend's copy of it. Yeah.
And had you played the full expansionized version or just the base game?
That I'm struggling to remember. I think it's possible that he had thrown in like an expansion of it, but I really don't remember. But I'm just that. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that I have like 8 boxes of Ankh sitting in my room right now. Like, I can't do a thing without going whole hog into it.
So speaking of you going whole hog into it, did you sleeve the game? I know you have a penchant for sleeving game.
You know what? I don't think I did, because it is a ridiculous array of cards. Like, it is just like piles and piles and piles and piles and piles of cards. Yeah, no, that would have been too much even for me.
That's a high bar. To say too much even for you is that's
I mean, it really, really is, because I definitely am way too obsessive in that regard.
So why did you end up having me like basically sell it for you?
I was realistic with myself, I guess, because the thing that's also hard about it is, despite having gone to the lengths to get it, it's a game that was never going to mean as much to anyone that hadn't played World of Warcraft, right?
Right.
And it's also like quite specific in player count number, because what's kind of odd about the game, I think it's a 2 to 4 player game exclusively. But I think you ideally actually want 2 or 4 players, like, you know, either 1v1 or 2v2 is the idea. So you kind of have to assemble like either a person, but ideally 3 other people that care enough about World of Warcraft to like actually engage in it. And I just kind of knew that wasn't going to happen. It's also like, it's a beast in terms of, not necessarily in terms of like sheer weight, but it's definitely a lot to have to explain, and it's a long game. It's like, you know, 3 or 4 hours to play it. So it was just on the absurd end of, this is not going to get played,
right?
And for a box that size, I just couldn't justify it.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it was starting to disintegrate as well. So I was like, well, I'm gonna get rid of this before it's like completely. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think that is an unfortunate story. That's like, there are lots of different versions of this I have, where, for example, like Discworld Ankh-Morpork was another one, which is also was prior to like the Nanti Narking reprint, a hard to acquire game, which I had a lot of affinity for the license for.
Right.
Acquired, I remember we played that game together and just kind of didn't really love it.
Yeah.
There's a lot to like about it, and actually I was surprised when we went back to Nanti Narking, like, to rediscover some of the fun of it, at least. But the Discworld version is just a little bit more quirky because it's so specific to that license. So all the characters have weird Discworld names, and I was the only person that had any like relation to any of that. But yeah, another good example of a game that was not worth the effort to get in the end, having played one game of it and then moved on from it.
I know we're sort of dunking on games now, and I don't want to make this a whole like, God, we were screwed when we got this game. But one more game, and I have a feeling that a lot of people might share this experience with this game, but Dead of Winter a couple years ago was a game that was super hot, super hard to find, super popular. And this was another thing where I was trying to track it down to have like a big event night with soccer friends, and I eventually got a copy, but didn't get a chance to play mine, couldn't get the schedules lined up, and ended up playing it like some months afterwards with Boardgame friends for the first time. And it was just another instance of having that sort of cold water splashed on my like blazing desire for the latest hotness. And that's not to say, like, obviously I totally get getting excited for things, and I think that's very cool, but I think it's important to like understand that these are, again, just games. And I've said this on the show before, but whenever I get like super heated for a game that everybody's talking about, I just think of 5 years ago, what the latest hotness was and how I feel about it now, and how it's like, to me, like those games were everything back then, and now they're just a game. Like Rising Sun, I remember how crazy it was. Blood Rage, how crazy that was. And those are great games. Those are games I have in my collection and love to play. But, you know, they are not these like unattainable crazy things anymore. And it's important to remember that every game more or less will get to that point, you know. And come to think of it, on the flip side, a game that I had been pursuing for a long time, a game that was out of print, and actually, unfortunately, I think is still out of print, but I had to track down for a long time. I think it's become a little easier to acquire, but Ugg-Tect was a game that was super, super hard to find. Finally got a copy of it. Had this high expectation that it'd be really, really fun. I think the first time we played it was at a Barrage Con. And for those who don't know, Ugg-Tect is a game where you are split into teams, and there is a lead on each team, a leader, who carries this inflatable club, sort of like the archetypical cartoon caveman club. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get your team to construct these structures with little pieces. But the only way that you can get them to do that is by grunting, basically. And they have like a sort of a table in front of them where they can sort of decipher what your grunts are, and you are supposed to, smack the head of the person who makes a mistake on your team when they misinterpret your grunts. And it ended up being as fun as I had ever hoped. So sometimes, that pursuit of a game does pay off. I will say, and again, Kellen is rolling his eyes because he knows what I'm going to say here, is that one of the reasons why I enjoyed it so much is Kellen was on my team. And I remember when I was the lead designer, whenever he would misinterpret my grunt, I was especially violent in my bopping his head. So yeah, that was a game that was super, super fun.
Ugg-Tect is fantastic. It's kind of the rare sort of like exceedingly silly game that I'm absolutely okay with.
Sure.
Because no one comes out looking good in Ugg-Tect. It's just like everyone just looks ridiculous. Whether you're on the architect side or the builder side, it really doesn't matter. It's sort of like a different twist on the sort of journey I have is one where I went out in search of a game and ended up with something completely differently. And this kind of like tracks back a long time ago to when I was living in South Africa. And one of the things that is worth saying about living and growing up in South Africa is it's some of these things that I've now come to take for granted, easy access to things. And that, obviously it's very different even in an internet age, but especially at that point in time in South Africa, it wasn't always easy just to get access to games and toys and everything that you could get anywhere else in the world. Like I've mentioned this a couple of times in the Discord, we couldn't buy Nintendo consoles growing up. Like it was just a part of gaming history that just didn't really exist in official capacity in South Africa, which is wild.
What was your console? Was it one of these weird
I
ones?
was a PC guy. Yeah, I was just, yeah. And I mean, through and through, I just grew up playing PC games. PlayStation showed up, but that was it, yeah.
I'm not so much into the video game culture anymore, but I remember as a kid, I had a Nintendo for sure, and I had a collection that was like my pride and joy. But I remember whenever I'd hear folks in England talk about video games, they would have these like systems that I'd never heard of.
Oh, that's actually funny because I had, not on the console front, but so my mom is English and she had a ZX Spectrum.
Right, okay, all these things, yeah.
So that's a computer from like the early 80s, and that's actually one of the PCs I grew up on, actually, funnily enough.
Okay.
Playing games off audio cassettes, which is...
crazy, wild stuff.
Yeah, what a time. But anyway, so at some point, we had a family friend who had HeroQuest. So this was an old copy of HeroQuest, because I forget exactly when that game came out, but they'd had it for several years at that point, and we went over, and my brother and I played it, and we were just like blown away by this. And then they had got it overseas at some point, but we weren't familiar exactly with when, and because we were very young. But it became my brother and I's mission to try find HeroQuest for whatever cost. And, you could go to any store in South Africa and no one would ever have it because it was just one of those things. But we made it a point when we came to the UK because we have family out there. So in, I think, the late 90s, like 1998, we went to the UK on a holiday, and this was my brother's and I's sole mission. We were just going to go to every store and try to find HeroQuest, not knowing that it was pretty well out of print even at that point. So we go into Hamleys, we go into like every store
Hamleys.
In London we can find, and they don't have it.
I'm a big Hamleys guy, by the way. I don't know if I ever said that.
Oh, Hamleys is great. I was actually because I was in London for the first time, probably since that trip, actually, about 3 years ago, and Hamleys is still amazing. But anyway, at some point, someone directed us, I forget who, to like a Games Workshop. And now, if you're familiar with Games Workshop, they are the creators of Warhammer 40K, but they're not a traditional games seller. Like, you would not go there and find a HeroQuest, but we didn't know this. So we stumbled into a Games Workshop, asked them about HeroQuest, and it's like, well,
I see where this is going.
We don't really have that, but let me tell you about Warhammer. And this was my first discovery of Warhammer. And we actually came home with a giant starter box of Warhammer Fantasy. And like, I remember that to this day, of just this idea that, we went on this, in our heads, this quest, and came back with something which in our heads was better, because Warhammer ended up being like such a huge hobby for my brother and I. We were playing it. We found a local club of it. Weirdly enough, there was a small community of people they were buying their stuff overseas, but there was people in our small town playing Warhammer. So it just was something we were playing a lot throughout high school, buying miniatures from, wherever we could, painting them. And my love for Warhammer, like, persists to this day. Like, in fact, actually, I was this close to buying a new Warhammer game today. Another fun story. There's a new version of Kill Team that is like actually what I was looking for. It's called Fire Team, but we'll talk about that in a future episode. But yeah, no, I went in across the world effectively trying to find one game and came away with what was basically one of my newest and greatest hobbies at that time.
That's a great story. I remember playing HeroQuest for the first time as a kid and just having like one of those, wow, like games can be this. Like this is what I want a game to be, and this is sort of it. It was like evolution from like, those first games of like Risk and stuff to that, and then like Dungeons and Dragons was another step.
Right.
And it's one of those things where you can like opens up a world that you never thought was there.
I mean, because actually, like, bringing this full circle, like, again, we grew up on computer games and RPGs, and this was like that, like, made into like a board game. So it was
exactly.
It was like everything that my brother and I loved, just in, oh my God, you can get this in a box.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've got a story not so much about acquiring a game, but this is more about playing a game. This is not actually about a board game, but this is also another shout out to Shut Up and Sit Down, because I remember watching their review of Mega Games and the Watch the Skies game that they played. And so I remember watching that years ago and thinking it was just amazing. And then finding out there was going to be a Watch the Skies locally. And this, again, I told my soccer friends about it, and they were game. But I was on this mission, because the way that worked was when you registered, you picked the country that you were going to represent, and then everybody would have the role as like the head of the government and the vice president or the vice prime minister or whatever it was, depending on the government. And then it was like a UN ambassador and all these different roles, head of science. And so I wanted to be the president of the United States. No surprise. And so I remember that they were going to start selling tickets at a certain time, and I logged in. Like, it was at 9 o'clock when I started selling tickets, and I signed up at like 9:10, and like half the nations were gone, and US was way gone. And super disappointed, because I was going to have to settle for, I don't know, South Africa or something.
Oh, wow. What a blow that would be.
But then, miracle, they said that, there was something wrong with the system, and like not all the roles had been available or whatever. And so they were going to do it like the next day at 9 o'clock. And they sent this out in retrospect. I think the way they sent this out was like, hey, I know nobody cares about this, but things sort of messed up, so we're going to redo it. But in my head, it was like this amazing reprieve. Like, oh my God, another chance. But I'm sure nobody really cared. And the next day I was like driving around for work, and I had like alarm set up for like 5 minutes to 9, 3 minutes to 9, like 30 minutes to 9. I had like everything set up, so there was no way I was going to miss it. And I found myself, I had to be on the road, like in that crucial stretch. I think maybe I was trying to get somewhere, thinking like, okay, I can make it to my destination and then like sit down and sit on the phone and like get this thing done. But, LA traffic, I ended up getting stuck. I was like on the road, and the countdown is ticking, and, it's like a minute left. And so I just immediately exited. I got off the next exit on the freeway, and I parked my car, like, I don't think illegally, but perhaps it was, and just like sat there, and like the minute things went live, signed in, and got the president of the United States as I wanted to. Again, I'm sure in retrospect nobody was doing this. There's no chance that anybody cared that much. But yeah, did my damnedest to do it and got it. And that ended up being a great time. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't watched the videos that Shut Up and Sit Down did about Mega Games, and specifically Watch the Skies, to go ahead and watch them. It was a great time. My friends and I all dressed up in the appropriate regalia. I had my Secretary of Defense wearing a cowboy hat and like, USA socks and everything. It was a fantastic experience. So that was one of the lengths that I've gone to play a game.
I was worried for a second that this was going to turn into a you trying to log in while driving story.
Right. No, never that.
Thankfully.
Yes.
That's actually a really good point. I think mega games in general, and that sort of game that requires like huge groups like that, like the circumstances that allow you to play games are often like so rare, like having to be at a convention, that's actually a really good example of the sort of thing we're talking about, because I've done a couple of mega games at Gen Con, and I remember like doing like a couple of mega games at Gen Con, like one of the ones that you and I did, Kellen. Do you remember that? When we were defending the world from kaiju. And like I remember my excitement over it, like to the extent that was almost like in my head, it was like the highlight of the trip. So in some essence, like I was traveling to Indianapolis for this one game, not exclusively, but that's kind of the feel that those sort of environments force upon you. And like it reminds me also of, know, we played a game of Blood on the Clock Tower when we were not familiar with anything that the game was, but we had to make like an hour and a half drive to the other side of LA just to get to a place where enough people were gathering in order to play that game. And you loved it, Mark.
I did love it. I was a big fan. I continue to be a huge fan of Blood on the Clock Tower. I've never said a disparaging word.
So that's it for our stories of hard to acquire games and the lengths that we've gone to get them. But we, as always, are much more interested in hearing your stories. And I think one of the best ways that you can share your stories with both us and other people in the community is through our Discord. This is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And if you're not familiar, Discord is just a glorified chat program that you can run on your PC, you can run on your phone. It's very accessible, very easy to use. And our Discord community is fantastic. A lot of board gamers. It is the best. It's one of the kindest, genuinely one of the kindest, friendliest places on the internet. You will show up and people will be very warm and welcoming and be interested in talking to you about the games that you want to play. So if you've not already signed up to our Discord, head over to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord and tell us all your stories about the lengths that you've gone to, how far you've had to travel to get games, how many hoops you've had to dive in, or like absurd amounts of money you've paid just to acquire specific games, and why it was so important that you did.
I can't wait to hear these stories. I'm sure, we got hundreds, if not thousands of people on Discord, and I can't wait to hear the funniest stories and the lengths people have gone. I'm sure they're great.
Yeah, no, me too. I can't imagine exactly just how much on the extreme end some people have gone to for some of these games, given how rabid our community is. The other ways you can reach out to us are via email at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. Otherwise, we're on all other social media. We're on Twitter at BRDGameBarrage, or you can find us on Facebook at boardgamebarrage.com/Facebook. That's going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Kellen and Mark, thank you so much for joining me. Goodbye.
Bye. No bloopers for this episode. Don't know why.